This is Wandering Universe. Today, I'll explore a historian who was the first human record keeper. His name is Herodotus, a man who was a meticulous writer who kept a record of everything he saw on his adventure of Egypt. So, let's go exploring. He is the very man himself, as the artist depicted him back then. That's what he looked like. Unfortunately, the invention of photography didn't come around until about 2,000 years later. Here's another one of seated Herodotus, as you can see here, the very man who first invented record keeping of accounts that he saw on his travels to Egypt. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background history of Herodotus before I go into deeper details. Herodotus was born in 484 BC in the Greek town of Halicarnassus, a harbour city with a rocky coastline. Today it is known at the Gulf of Bodron, and I'll show you the map right here. That's the very city here itself along the coastal line of Greece, as you can see here. It would have been a very nice place, actually quite exotic as well. This is what it looks like today. This is the ruins of the actual city itself. It's the mausoleum of Halicarnassus. I'll show you another picture. This is the actual city itself today. There's nothing left except the amphitheater right here, as you can see in the background of the very ruins of the city itself. It's just a shame. It would have been quite a luxurious city for its time, where a lot of Greeks would have gone there as a resting place to take a break, to recharge and revive, and then maybe just go back to the hometown and get into their own business. But it would have been a very nice city back then. He was bred and raised by a very wealthy and somewhat aristocratic family. His ambition or passion was to write a historical account of the Greek-Persian Wars. His curiosity just couldn't help himself as he went out on his travels in search of information. At age 27, he left Halicarnassus, set sail to the island of Samos in the Aegean Sea. It looks like a fishing village here. At least it's not a concrete jungle where you see in cities in America and in Europe. So it looks like a very nice township here, and it looks like a pretty peaceful township as well, whether you don't see the hustle and bustle of city dwelling life or get stuck in traffic jams and all that stupidity. And if you want to plan on going to the island Samos, well, please do so, because what you see is what you're going to get here. A nice beachside resort, lovely clear aqua pristine waters there, and the mountain ranges are quite gorgeous. So if you're planning on your next holiday to go to southern Italy and the islands surrounding that region, please do so. He spent some time there alone and learned a dialect of the Ionians. He returned to Halicarnassus and took part in freeing his native city from the tyranny of Lycidamus. This is the only picture I found of the very tyrant king himself. He was very brutal in his nature. He wasn't friendly. He was authoritarian, and whatever he said basically went. So that's the type of person he was, and I'll give you an example what he did to the actual city itself. This was sieged by Alexander the Great, but as you can see, back in Lygamdius time, he would have tried to do something similar, as you can see in this illustration. So the city itself looked like it was quite a pristine city. It actually looked quite nice actually for its time. So I think Herodotus would have been pretty on the ball with his description. He left some time after and spent the next few years traveling and researching life around 455 BC thereabouts. It's not an accurate date, but that's what archaeologists have predicted. He traveled to Greece, Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey, Thrace, Scythia, Egypt, Tyre, and Phoenicia, and Palestine, then to Babylon. If you want to know what it looked like in ancient times, well, this is a map that depicts it. As you can see, Asia Minor is there. This is the Adriatic Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. This is Iberia, which is today's Spain. Gaul, which is today's France. These are the Alp mountain region. I call it the Swiss Alps, the Austrian Alps, and here would be Germanica, and then heading towards Eastern Europe, the Caucasus Mountains right up here, and this is Northern Africa, and this would have been the bottom area of Gibraltar heading towards, and not bad, it's not that hard actually to cross to Northern Africa back then. So that's how Herodotus saw the Mediterranean region during his time, and some parts would have been quite nice actually to visit back then due to its stone construction technology. So it would have been quite pleasant back then, apart from egotistical tyrants who were just interested in invading and conquering and destroying the region itself, all for the purpose of raising money to live a lavish, privileged lifestyle that they truly couldn't afford. He retired and made a home at Therium, a Greek colony in southern Italy on the Gulf of Tarentum. He died an old man. The age is unknown. It's possibly around between 55 to 70 years old, and he was buried there. I'll show you. This is what's left of Therium itself. It would have been a lovely little township. Not exactly a huge city. We're not talking about skyscrapers, concrete jungles that you see, like, for example, New York City. This would have been a lovely stone constructed township that Herodotus would have enjoyed the rest of his life, believe it or not. His history records were recited at the Olympic Festival, which moved many Herodotus, I think that's how it's pronounced, and wrote 9 books named after the 9 muses by the assembled Greeks in their enthusiasm, so they were moved by it. It was more likely those titles were named later by a grammarian, citing that Herodotus was close to finishing the last chapter in his last book, but it was left unfinished, so they were deeply moved by his works. This is one of the rare parchments that was found of Herodotus's work, and as you can see, what you see is what you get. This is a paper parchment that was made out of lime reed that see along the River Nile, and he would have spent a lot of time using this sort of paper. It wouldn't have been cheap to buy back then, especially if it was made by hand, but due to his wealthy background and he worked as a trader merchant, he was able to afford the luxury to buy this sort of technology. He was into seeking the truth in life and had a love for poets. He took a deep interest in the divine side and the psychological. This was his destiny, as this became his life's work. His most famous account was his time he spent in Egypt. When he was there, he saw the accession of King Cambyses, the history of the Persian Wars. He basically wrote what he saw during his time in Egypt. He wrote book 2 like an episode that occupies the whole book, like watching an episode of a mystery drama on TVs, for example, the Twilight Zone. He got most of his information from various accounts from priests who were his tour guides, to Greeks, Ionians, Arabians, Libyans, right down to Syrians. In book 2, the first chapter described who was top dog of Egypt during his time there, and that was King Cambyses. The Ionians and Aeolians were used as slaves, and he began a war in Egypt, and there were lots of Greek citizens there. So pretty well occupied country, may I say. This is the only picture I found of the very king himself. Next to him in the far right would be his father, and then next to him would be his son that succeeded the throne. This is what an Ionian looked like. To me, they seem to look a bit like Orthodox Greek priests preaching to the crowd there. And the crowd, if you look at the type of hats they're wearing, they look very Turkish, Middle Eastern. So it was a mix of races there back then. And this is what the aliens look like. They look a little bit Hellenistic back then, and from what I can see in this coin, it looks like they had a love of horses. Horses was a very important symbolism that identified who they were. And I think they would have been very good horse riders, very good horse rearers, and they would have had horse stables and horse farms that they would have traded, brought and sold, and used for battle or for transport or for any other means necessary. So their economic business, should I say, would have been in horse trading. He said that the quote, the Egyptians esteemed themselves the most of the ancient of the human race. Yet under the king Psamitiches, he considered Phrygians more ancient than themselves than the rest of mankind. End of quote. Herodotus, while spending a good deal of time traveling around Egypt, he hired a tour guide, which were mainly priests, showed him the ropes of the customs, traditions, culture, and lifestyle of the way around the country. He got to know his way around places and spoke to lots of people from all sorts, from Greeks to Ionians to Arabians, Libyans, and to Syrians. He was a well-versed man. He was meticulous with his words on paper and wrote a great detail on the River Nile, as he had a particular fascination for the river system. He saw Egypt mostly as a spacious plain. The soil was rich and slimy, and a rather unusual acrid smell to it, something like sulfur that burns in the nostrils. And I'll give you an example here. This is what he means. So if you ever come across this type of soil, whether it's still around in Egypt or certain parts of Egypt, the more inland you go, you may come across this type of soil. And if you smell this acrid, acidic type of soil during a very hot 45 degrees Celsius day, and it burns your nostrils and it really dries the insides of your nostrils, then obviously this is what Herodotus experienced himself. So if you're ever going to travel to Egypt one day and you're going to go far inland, especially to the western side of Egypt, this is what you're going to experience. I'm not sure if most of it is now sand. It could still have this type of soil in existence on the plain. He believed this soil would have been harmful to the pyramids, as he thought that it might have eroded a lot of the limestone due to this substance. There were a long chain of Arabian mountains. Now this is interesting, stretching south and southwest of the region in a rectangular inclination to the Red Sea. And I've got a black and white photo to show you this, but I'll continue on. He found Egypt to be a hot and dry place, and finding available water nearby was really scarce. He said the Egyptians used a calendar that went by 12 months, 30 days exacting to 1 month, and adding 5 days to every year. He called it a uniform revolution of time. He also cited that they came up with 12 names for their 12 gods, and the Grecians borrowed them. They also had a 7-class caste system in Egypt, very much in line with the Indian caste system. Now I'm going to get into the pyramids just briefly here, because I'm going to do future videos about his account of what he saw the pyramids himself and how majestic they were. Whether they look like as they are today, I don't know. It is skeptical, but I'm just going to tell the story of his account of how he saw the pyramids back then. He believed the pyramids of Memphis were built with stones drawn from these mountains. He's talking about the Arabian mountains. He saw a steep and sandy mountain where certain pyramids were erected. They'd stretched towards the south. I'm going to give you an illustration. This is just a depiction of how Herodotus would have seen the pyramids back then. As you can see, what he saw, that there was still limestone casing here. along the side walls of the pyramids. He would have seen that there were several obelisks that surrounded the circumference of the pyramid, and he would have seen a lot of built up sand that leveled up to the bottom base of the pyramids. He didn't see any gold or copper or silver apex stone caps at the top of the tip of the pyramid there, and he would have seen that it was more of a barren place. There wouldn't have been many settlers there traveling around and exploring the pyramids back then. So this is what he would have seen back then if you use your imagination here. When he passed through the area, he passed them with an awe of silence. He couldn't believe the magnitude of it. He said it was built by a prince named Maurice, who was the last of the monarchs in Egypt. The other pyramids were built before him were Shapos, Chephren, and Mycenius, and I think you know whom he's talking about. An aerial view shot from above, circulating around the area of Memphis or Giza Plateau today. This is what I mean. If he's talking about, as you can see, if you follow my arrow here, if he's talking about these Arabian mountains here, or further down, that's not depicted in this photograph, the actual Arabian mountains there, then it would have been like many miles for the quarry site to carve the stones, build them, and then drag them across on wooden sleds all the way to this very site here. So he thought, what he found, that the quarry site was more in the southern southwest region in the Arabian Mountains here. But I think that the quarries would have been further out here, or the quarries would have been further out here. He didn't know back then, but that's what he thought. It's still left to skepticism today, what he accounted, but what you see is what you get in the photograph right here. So it seems that the Egyptian society as a whole had their fair share of discrimination bias from the Sicilians and the Assyrians, as they were the new inhabitants wanting to settle in Egypt. He got his sources from the Oracle of Ammon, talks about the takeover of Egypt from neighboring tribes that wanted a piece of desert land to do whatever they wanted to do without question. I think it's just an excuse to let themselves off the hook, as they simply had nowhere to go, whilst the Greeks and Phoenicians were inhabiting the borders. There was an attempted takeover of Ethiopia and enslaving the inhabitants once in Egypt and work the land under forced labour, mostly to shovel shit around for the lazy upper echelons of Egypt, may I say. This is another depiction of Egypt. This is another photograph of how it looked back then. I think it's around 1862. I think the previous photo was 1902, so I'll correct that now. This is 1862. As you can see, there's a lot of rubble surrounding the pyramid. There's not much sand, so a lot of sand would be dug away around the bottom base of the pyramids that would have surrounded the pyramids back in Herodotus' time. And also you can see there's a lot of brickwork that was just thrown around, messed about, just a barrage of mess there. And as you can see, there's a lot more sand than the acrid soil that he described, and there's a lot of limestone that's still encased at the bottom base of the pyramids there. So it's very interesting to see to compare actually what Herodotus described and saw back then, to compare what this photograph saw to how it is today. So it's very interesting comparison. So according to Herodotus, what he saw was a calamitous race war for world domination of top dog power. As simple as that. there was segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchising of the Egyptians under Greek authority. Yet the country was in an economic mess, heading towards depression, and so it was. And so they were in some way relying on foreign aid. I mean, how depressing could it get? But this got them further indebted to the Greeks once they realized their impoverished economy was no better off than it was in the Old Kingdom. And I'll just illustrate this. This is the head bust of Ammon that Herodotus saw back then. And I'll just give you another illustration of the Ionian Wars. This was an illustration depiction of the burning of Sardis during the Ionian Revolt. As you can see here, basically these people had no choice. They just had to pack their bags, take whatever, and just get the hell out of the city, while the Assyrians were just basically decimating the place. And here's another picture describing the invasion during the Greek-Persian Wars. And as you can see in this illustration, the Greeks were preparing themselves for battle. They made whatever weapons at their disposal and just hastily, not very strategically, placed themselves in this particular landmark and said, right, we're ready for a military combat. And as you can see, the Persians on the other side of this picture seem to be more robust and economically and financially viable in order for them to do their military campaign. So Egypt during Herodotus's time wasn't economically sound. The way I think I would have seen it myself if I went back through time, it would have been a pretty disturbing place to live in. It would have been pretty dirty, it would have been run down, it would have been very primitive lifestyle, the customs would have been pagan religion, very superstitious of their pagan gods, and also the economy would have been run on a debased economy, meaning that whatever currencies of gold they had left in reserve, they would have started clipping them to debase the coins. Then whatever was left over of the clippings, they would have debased the currency by making the clippings and smelted the clippings, mixing them with copper, zinc, and whatever garbage that they made the coins with, and then they distributed out to the population. So in the end, though, it was an impoverished society, and that's all because of empire after empire, after invasion after invasion. These tyrannical, authoritarian emperors, kings, whatever you want to call them, just basically wanted to decimate Egypt and just run it to the ground. And the natives there just basically had no choice but just get on with their life and just go with it. And if they had to rely on foreign aid during Herodotus's time, that means the economy was just finished for Egypt. As soon as the technology of ships arrived along the coastal region, especially in the Suez Canal that divided Egypt, was it for Egypt. They were finished. There was nothing they could do to revive its economic state. That was it. So that's all I have to say about that. In the near future, I'll be exploring further into the accounts of Herodotus' travels of Egypt. He draws a fascinating but contradictory account on the construction of the pyramids, the obelisks of Karnak, and other architectural discoveries that have left many archaeologists and historians today still highly skeptical of his findings. That's all for now.